If there's anyone that doesn't know that, I want to welcome all of you to the second of our 3 fall archaeology lectures. These coincide with the annual Oregon Archaeology Celebration, so they're an annual event. Tonight, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Jeff Smith, an archaeologist and associate professor of anthropology at the University of Nevada, Reno, where he also serves as the executive director of the Great Basin Paleo-Indian Research Unit. Jeff earned his PhD from the University of Wyoming in 2010 and joined the UNR faculty that same year. Still early in his career, Jeff has been remarkably productive, publishing more than 40 journal articles or book chapters, and also editing 3 volumes of Nevada archaeology. His research focuses on Great Basin prehistory and paleoecology, lithic technologies, hunter-gatherer mobility, and the peopling of the Americas. He's also collaborated widely in recent years with our own archaeologists out in the Great Basin, Dennis Jenkins, Tom Connolly, and others. Worked together at Fort Rock Cave in the last few years, and he's a great guy. As you can see tonight, Jeff is going to talk about Paleo-Indian Lifeways in the Big Empty.
Thank you everyone for coming out. It's nice to see so many old friends and new friends that I haven't met yet. I've been to Eugene a couple of times before. I've seen a few Ducks games over the years, and I always took the announcer at face value when he said it never rains in Austin Stadium. I'm starting to wonder if maybe he's not always telling the truth. So thanks for coming out on a great day. Like John mentioned, I am an associate professor at the University of Nevada, Reno, and I've been working in the northern Great Basin on the other side of the Cascade Range since 2010. And so tonight what I'd like to talk about is some of my work in that area, much of which dovetails with what the museum staff and researchers have been doing in recent years. So if you've been to the Oregon Outback, some writers and authors have also referred to this region as the Big Empty. It's wide open spaces, general lack of population, beautiful sunsets, and a sense of solitude. The Oregon Outback is a land of colorful characters in deep time. People you might know, such as Dr. Dennis Jenkins, shown there on the left at Paisley Caves in 2011, or before him, Luther Cressman, who needs no introduction in this neck of the woods, or before him, cattle baron Bill Kitt, who moved across from the Willamette Valley in the early 20th century and amassed over 19,000 head of cattle and 68,000 acres by the time he died in the early 1950s. These are all interesting characters, but I'm going to talk about a time before any of these notable figures. And we're going to be discussing the late Pleistocene. So as many of you probably know from previous presentations at the museum, starting around 20,000 years ago, most of the valleys and wetlands in the Great Basin, including the Oregon Outback, had a series of large pluvial lakes. So these lakes would rise and fall with changes in temperature and precipitation. And so basins like Fort Rock and the Alvord Desert and Warner Valley and others contain these large bodies of water. The vegetation would have been similar after 20,000 years ago, although its distribution would have been somewhat different, with the tree line lower and shrubs and bushes possessing slightly different distributions. There were roughly 20 different species of Ice Age, genera of Ice Age mammals that went extinct during the last Ice Age. In the Great Basin, roughly 7 of these persisted until the time at which people had arrived in the region, and in the last few years, our understanding when people first got here has changed considerably thanks to work at the Paisley Caves and Rim Rock Draw. We think that this probably occurred sometime around 15,000 years ago, maybe a hair earlier, and the work that's been done in the Oregon Outback by the University of Oregon has started to change our whole understanding of how people got to the lower 48. Initially, it was long assumed that people traveled through an ice-free corridor sometime around 13,000 years ago, developing Clovis projectile points along the way. With the discoveries in the Oregon Outback, we now know that that's probably no longer correct. And a model of movement along the Pacific coast is probably currently the most likely explanation. And so that dovetails with some of the work that John did to fluted Clovis points in other parts of the western United States. Other sites like Sage Hang Gap Sheep Mountain, Lake on the Trail, Trout Creek Paleo Camp, also have clusters of fluted points, but we don't, again, know how these fit chronologically or potentially culturally with Clovis in other parts of the New World. Beginning around 12,900 years ago, the climate shifted, things became slightly cooler and wetter in many places, and this is really when we see the record of human occupation in the Northern Great Basin start to ramp up. So we see Younger Dryas age occupations between about 12,900 and 11,600 years ago at Cougar Mountain Cave, which is an understudied site that was dug in the 1950s by avocational archaeologist John Cowles. He recovered dozens of these western stem projectile points shown here. And more recently, one of our graduate students and part-time museum staff, Richie Rosenkrantz, has dated this piece of braided cordage to about 12,300, as well as 2 pieces of charcoal from the site. So his work is going to show some really interesting results in the next few months. Other sites that date to this general time period are Connolly Caves number 4, which has been the focus of the Archaeological Field School here at the University of Oregon for the last several years. Contains similar hasket points as well as bone, eye needles, and other artifacts dating to the Younger Dryas. After the end of the Younger Dryas, at about 11,600 years ago, regional populations seem to continue to increase. And so this is a time period from which the sandals from Fort Rock Cave, which are on display at the museum, date to. We have evidence that groups were producing rock art, a particular style known as Great Basin Carved Abstract. This is a panel from Long Lake, Oregon, recorded by Bill Cannon and Mary Hicks in the 1990s. Portions of that panel were found extending below Mazama Tefra, so we know that it's to some degree older than 7,700 years ago when that ash fell. We also have shell beads from the Oregon coast making their way into the interior portion of Oregon. These date to about 9,600 years ago, and these are from one of the rock shelters that I'll be talking about in a moment. The diagram on the right is called the sum probability distribution diagram. It's not very exciting to look at, but what it does demonstrate is that these blobs represent periods of time at archaeological sites throughout the Northern Great Basin. And roughly 36 different occupations in a lesser number of sites date to this early Holocene period. So we start to see occupations ramping up just after 11,000 years ago and increasing on a fairly steady pace until about 9,000 years ago. And so this tracks the spread and the increase in human populations in the Oregon Outback. If you look at the obsidian on which stone tools like fluted points or western stem points are made, they show regular patterns of use within different parts of the Great Basin. So in the northwestern portion of Nevada, where I worked for many years before I crossed the border into Oregon, we see a particular cyclical pattern of obsidian conveyance where groups moved almost up to the Oregon border and then back down to near Reno and then back north again. Conversely, in Oregon, people would cycle through the Oregon Outback and get down close to the modern Nevada border, but they didn't want to travel any further south. And so this suggests early in time there may have been regional populations entrenched or at least networks through which people recognized one another in the different parts of the Great Basin. As far as early diet goes, this is a question that is still largely unresolved because we have preserved organic food remains from places like Paisley and Connolly and some of these other rock shelters, and they provide very high resolution pictures for moments in time and moments in space. But what happened at many of the open air sites where preservation is not good, we're left wondering. Work at the Paisley Caves, Rinrock Draw, and some of these other very early sites now indicates that people probably coexisted with several different types of megafauna, including a mammoth or mastodon, camels and horses, and bison for perhaps as long as about 2,000 years here in Oregon. We don't have any unequivocal kill sites, so there's no mammoth skeleton with western stem points between the ribs, like exists with some Clovis sites in other parts of the world, and that's unfortunate. But what we do have is some preserved protein residues on stone tools from sites across the region, and that does suggest that these animals were at least occasionally killed or scavenged. Faunal remains from mostly early Holocene, but some latest Pleistocene sites are typically dominated by smaller animals, and jackrabbits seem to be a species that show up time and time again. But we also see some examples of larger animals like elk and deer, antelope, and mountain sheep, but these seem to occur at lower frequencies than at sites later in time, and we're not really quite sure why that is. We also see freshwater fish, waterfowl, sage-grouse, insects, and even in some cases, like Last Supper Cave, we see freshwater mussels being harvested from a nearby creek. So very broad diet, probably tied to the seasonal availability of resources. So what I want to talk about tonight is the work that we've done at the University of Oregon, University of Nevada, in conjunction with the University of Oregon, and how I've spent the course of my last decade out there so far. So the University of Nevada's Great Basin Paleo Indian Research Unit was set up in 2010, and it's an offshoot of an earlier entity called the Sundance Archaeological Research Fund. And this was set up by a private endowment donated by Joe and Ruth Kramer, a couple from Colorado, and they've really done a great deal to help Paleo-Indian archaeology here in the United States. And so the mandate that I operate under each year is that we spend 3 months with students doing fieldwork in remote locations, looking for and recording and excavating sites, mostly in open air contexts, but in a few cases that I'll be talking about rock shelters as well. We also team with staff from the Desert Research Institute in Reno, Nevada, and they help us out with our paleo-environmental reconstruction. So understanding what the landscape was like when people were living at these locations. So folks like Dr. Teresa Riston and Dr. Ken Adams have been instrumental in our efforts. So each summer we set up a camp. You may recognize this here from some recent photos up here in Oregon. We live, we laugh together, cook our meals together, play more horseshoes than anybody should ever play in their lives, and it's really a wonderful time to spend the summer. Over the years, we've found a number of remarkable artifacts in surface and buried contexts. This is a fluted point that was found at a visit at the Dietz site. This is Dr. Riston telling you what the stratigraphy is doing at the Little Steamboat Point rock shelter, which I'll be talking about. This is a site in Warner Valley. This is a bed of tephra that's about 30,000 years old, so unfortunately probably predates people in the region. Typically I hire graduate students to help out with my work, but I found that paying small children is actually a lot cheaper. This is my daughter, so she's already on my health insurance. So I don't have to pay her health insurance. And so this is the way we spend our summer, and it's really a pretty great time. So I want to talk about 3 sites tonight, and they represent 3 different phases of our work at UNR. So there's Warner Valley, which is coming to an end. There's Guano Valley, which is a project that's sort of in the middle of its completion, and a brand new project that we started actually working with the University of Oregon at Foxy-Woxy Valley. These sites are all further out into the big empty between Lakeview and Fields. So we're getting quite far out there, and we've left behind the creature comforts of Lakeview and Plush. So I'll start with Warner Valley. So we've been working at the far end of North Warner Valley about 45 minutes after the pavement ends in the town of Plush. This is the northernmost subbasin in the very large Warner Valley. And so in 2010, Bill Cannon from the Bureau of Land Management asked us to come out and do some survey and excavations. And so I'm going to be talking about 2 major portions of our research. The first is survey along these series of shorelines you see preserved here on the landscape. These are these parallel lines reaching the lower valley floor. These mark pauses in the retreat of pluvial Lake Warner after it reached its high stand. And so each of these lines represents a moment in time when there was a stable beach there for some unknown period. The other location that I want to talk about is the Little Steamboat Point 1, or LSP1 rock shelter. So over the course of 3 years, we surveyed about 10% of a 221 square kilometer area that we refer to as the Northern Warner Valley Study Area. And so our landforms were divided into canyons and uplands, into beach ridge portions that are marked by these parallel striations, and then by the valley floor, where the gradient of the slope and the beach ridges disappears. The shaded areas here, the gray areas, represent 500 by 500 meter squares that we surveyed walking back and forth and recording everything that we found. So in total we found 11 fluted points, at least 9 of which are consistent in shape and size with Clovis points from other parts of the New World. We found 11 crescents and 127 western stem points of various sizes, and these are just a few of the prettier ones that we found. I told my graduate students, if you find a fluted point on survey, I'll buy you a case of beer, thinking I would never have to pay that debt. One student from Georgia who had never done any sort of field work in the Great Basin anywhere ever found 6 over the span of a week. And I wish I could tell you he liked Coors Light or something equally inexpensive. That was not the case. So I had to take out a mortgage on my house to find these guys in here. The tables on the right here really just serve to illustrate 2 points. The first on the top is that most of the Paleo-Indian artifacts are restricted to these beach ridge parcels. We didn't find any in the canyons or the uplands. We found a few on the valley bottom. But this is important because if we can date those beach ridges, we can make arguments about when those sites were occupied, and so I'll talk about that in a moment. The more complicated table on the lower right-hand corner is simply illustrating that relative to other study areas in the surrounding region from North Warner Valley, the Paleo-Indian presence in Warner Valley seems to be very, very high. So statistically speaking, Warner Valley has a much higher proportion of Paleo-Indian artifacts relative to later point types than either the Fort Rock Basin, the Chewacon-Abert Basin, or nearby Skeens Mountains, which were recorded using similar survey techniques. So for whatever reason, North Warner Valley seem to be attracting early groups at a fairly high level. If we talk about one particular area, it really kind of captures what it is that we think we found in North Warner Valley. In one particular location, above a shoreline that's located at 1,390 feet in elevation, we found over and over again high numbers of western stem points, and in this particular location, fluted points as well, along with a couple of crescents. This would have been located next to a drainage that we creatively called Clovis Creek. It's not called that on a quad map or anything like that. And that probably provided an influx of water into Lake Warner as it paused in its retreat. And sometimes when you get these lakes and there's a shallow gravel bar or a beach ridge, water will pool behind those and form shallow back bar marshes. And we think that this was the case based on some of the geomorphological work and some of the paleo-environmental reconstruction work that Dr. Teresa Riston did as well. So in this area, we've got a number of fluted points concentrated around the creek with western stem points located nearby, but not in that same particular area. So Teresa's work showed that we're able to provide a rough reconstruction of Lake Warner's history. And so this is a typical lake level curve, and I just want to draw your attention to a few things. Along the bottom here is time. Along the y-axis here is elevation. And so using these different dots, these represent radiocarbon dates on shell, or in some cases soil, or volcanic tephra of known ages. These represent anchor points in time, as well as an elevation that we can connect. And so the dots are fairly secure in both time and space. The curves between them are interpretations. So this is not exactly what happened, but this is a general picture. And so we think that between about 18,000 and 14,500 years ago, Lake Warner peaked, and this is roughly synchronous with other lakes in that area. There seems to have been a pause, and even perhaps a little rebound sometime after 14,500 years ago and 12,500 years ago at that 13-meter shoreline. And just above that shoreline, that's where we find most of our fluted points, suggesting that they date to that interval. And that's not as tight of a window as we'd like to see, but it's consistent with Clovis points from other parts of the New World. We see that after 12,500 years ago, the lake has a fairly steady repeat, and then the valley floors dry by about 9,650 years ago. And whereas the distribution of fluted points is restricted to 1390 meters elevation, suggesting that they date to around the time when that lake was there, western stem points occur both at that elevation with the fluted points, and they seem to track the lake as it recedes and out onto the valley floor. So I'll come back to what that all means in a second. Our work at the LSP rock shelter took place during the same amount of time. It's a very small rock shelter. There's a graduate student for scale here. Between 2010 and 2015, we excavated roughly 24 square meters. We were unfortunately aided by an illegal excavation, which occurred sometime during the winter of 2012, where somebody came out to the site and in the span of a few days probably ripped out 7,000 years of time and made a real mess of it. So it's normally more than we would like to excavate at an archaeological site, but we had some cleanup work to do. So this shows the location of our excavation grid. It's not a huge site by any means, but good enough to get out of the sun and the rain. These ovals here show different features that Dr. Kennedy, who's here tonight, analyzed the plant remains from as part of her dissertation work. So we have a series of campfires built in the interior of the site, some of which are late Holocene, some of which date to as old as about 9,500 or 9,600 years ago. So this data is a few years old. This table's a few years old. We've now got another 10 or 15 radiocarbon dates from the site, but the general pattern is it hasn't changed. Folks really started to use the site around 9,500 years ago. We've got a series of radiocarbon dates there. And then beginning around 9,300 years ago, so within as narrow a range as a couple of centuries, people left the site. There's a 3,000 or 4,000 year occupation, and it's not until environmental conditions improve during the late Holocene that people seem to come back, and this jives fairly well with our survey data, which also has a very large gap during the middle Holocene. So initially very busy, and then nothing for a few thousand years. Technology there is represented primarily by western stem points, as well as a series of foliage or cascade points, and I think we've got the transition when these 2 point styles really go from one to the other. We don't have any northern side notch points, which mark the early Holocene, and that jives with our radiocarbon date record from the location. Jackrabbits were at the top of the menu at Little Steamboat Point 1, and if you've ever driven through Warner Valley, you'll probably see they're sleeping on the side of the road. It's quite frequent. So they're still abundant today, and sometimes a little bit too slow. A student of ours, Evan Pellegrini, analyzed just a small sample, 3 square meters of jackrabbit bones from below Mesogotephra, and indicated that there's at least 17 jackrabbits represented, 11 cottontails. And what he identified, which is really interesting from my perspective, is that the axial skeleton elements, so the core body portions, are typically absent. Jackrabbits are largely represented by their head bones and their leg bones. And so this could mean a couple of different things. It could mean that the axial skeleton bones are less dense and maybe they're breaking down faster in the rock shelter. It could also mean that groups were grinding the bodies of these jackrabbits and using the ribs and the spines to make some sort of bone meal. That's also possible. So whatever this pattern represents, the bones do seem to have been processed in a very systematic manner. And if you extrapolate what Evan found in just 3 squares to 24 square units, the numbers of jackrabbits really go through the roof. Another student followed up on Evan's work. This is a thesis done by Maddie Ware a couple of years ago, and she did a use-wear analysis of stone tools from the site. So she looked at 35 obsidian flakes from below the Mesogotephra. So these are dating older than 7,700 years ago. And she used obsidian tools developed in an experiment. So these are replicated stone tools to butcher rabbits. They were organic rabbits, free range. Probably the most expensive thesis project any of my students have ever done. So she generated wear that accrues on her experimental tools by cutting the hide, by dismembering the rabbits, and by slicing the meat into strips. So she's got hide processing, carcass processing, and meat processing. And what she found in the 35 tools below Mesogotephra is that it was primarily hide processing that was occurring. but it was also, to a lesser degree, carcass processing. And she argues that not only were groups using the rabbits for meat, but they were also making rabbit skin blankets. And during this period, there are isolated examples of rabbit skin robes from across the Great Basin. And so I thought that was a pretty interesting study that dovetailed nicely with evidence. And finally, Dr. Kennedy looked at some of the plant remains from the early Holocene deposits, and what she found was that groups were relying in large part on local foods. But one of the more interesting things I think she found was that she identified charred cattail seeds, and by the time that groups had rolled into LSD1 after about 9,300 years ago, North Warner Valley is largely dry. And so the nearest wetland, as far as we can tell, would have been about 10 kilometers away. So this indicates that groups were probably bringing in marsh resources from maybe a day's walk or so. So if we put this all together in Warner Valley, what we see is a changing pattern in lifeways over time, beginning as early as 14,500 years ago, but probably closer to 13,000 years ago if I had to guess. We see groups camped along the shore of Lake Warner as it paused in its late Pleistocene retreat, focusing in particular along that creek side and a marsh-side interface. After 12,500 years ago, the fluted points are gone. We see people using Western STEM technology moving south in the valley down slope, presumably following the retreating Lake Warner, and that valley floor is dry by about 9,650 years ago, or thereabouts. At that same time, the LSP1 rock shelter is occupied for the very first time by people processing jackrabbits, and that pattern persists for a few centuries, and then it ends as well. And so you see the intersection of human behavior and climate change, especially clear here in Warner Valley, where when there were marshes, people were relying on marshes. When the marshes were gone, they were relying on jackrabbits. When things became too hot and dry in Warner Valley, they left elsewhere. They went elsewhere. And if I had to guess, I would say they moved south into Warner Valley, where the Warner Lakes, closer to the modern town of Plush, would have still been providing fresh water and marsh resources. And so over the last few years, we've written some papers on this area. It's generated some really interesting master's thesis and some PhD work. And so this is kind of reaching the end of its research cycle. We're doing our final reporting now. The second place I want to talk about is Guano Valley, and this is work that we've been conducting over the last few years. This is primarily the domain of one of my PhD students named Derek Rowe, and so what I'll be talking about today is largely a part of his effort. So Guano Valley is located southeast of Warner Valley, and we went here in 2016 expecting to find nothing, and I didn't want to tell my students that, but I said too much. In science, sometimes we like to generate what's known as negative evidence, and so I really thought we would find no evidence of early groups in Guano Valley. And I thought that that would be the case because it's an extremely small valley. It doesn't have any of those Pleistocene beach ridges that Warner Valley has, and so it doesn't have the really obvious signs that life would have been good for groups. Today, if you've been along Highway 140, it cuts across here and goes up Doherty Slide. The modern playa is here, Shirt Branch is up here. And this is a really interesting system. The reason why Guano Valley doesn't have any of those well-preserved beach ridges high on the mountains is there's a channel at the north end of the valley that would have let any water that had accumulated in Guano Valley flow north through a fairly large canyon and out into Catlin Valley. And so you could turn up the rain as high as you want and drop the temperature as high as you want, but most of that water is going to escape north through the outflow channel. And this means that during wet periods, Guano Valley could never have contained a lake that was deeper than about 2 or 3 meters, and that's prime marsh water depth in terms of wetlands. So this is something that we figured out as we started our project up there, is that it actually was probably going to be a pretty good location for groups during the late Pleistocene. And this lake may have filled and emptied pretty quickly with changing conditions during the early Holocene and the late Pleistocene. Most of the water in Guano Valley is received from Guano Creek up here in the north, Sage Hen Creek, and these three in particular are an unnamed drainage and 2 others adjacent that bring water from Nevada into Oregon. So if you ever hear a Nevadan complain about where all the water is going, Now you don't. Going to Oregon, like tonight. So we spent a couple of weeks surveying this area along what we figured out would have been the shoreline, and we found nothing. It was one of the most frustrating survey experiences of my career, and I was ready to throw in the towel and call it a project. And I went to town to get gas or something, and my students went off and worked, and they came back, and they showed me their notebooks filled with drawings of western stem points and concave-based points. And said, Dr. Smith, do you think this is anything? I said, well, yeah. So they took me down there, and so now I don't even survey with them anymore. I've just learned that my luck is better if I go do something else. Let them figure it out. They're better at this than I am. So they uncovered an amazing record of Paleo-Indian archaeology on the surface, western stem points, crescents, one fluted point, concave base points, but it's not along the lake shores. It's at the very south end of the valley where there was a delta that would have brought water from these three creeks into a fairly expansive marsh area set off to the side from this lake. We haven't found anything near the remnants of the Pleistocene lake. So we're zooming in here. There's the state line. This is our project area. This is the shoreline, the maximum elevation that fluvial Lake Guano would have reached. So we're away from the lake's edge and in this series of channels, and it's a little bit hard to see. You can see there's scars here on the landscape. The browner ones represent desiccated marshes, so dried out areas that have had water fairly recently. We excavated a series of 5 backhoe channels across, backhoe trenches across the channels, trying to find evidence that these were short-lived channels or long-lived channels, and especially if they had anything we could date in there to understand when these channels were most active. And unfortunately, we did find a tephra, but it was a mix of very, very old tephras washing in from the uplands in those creeks, and so we don't really have any good chronological control over this delta system right now, and that's too bad, but that's kind of characteristic of a project that's midlife. In total, we found 637 western stem points. If you look at Paleo-Indian artifact per acre, to the best of my knowledge, this is one of the most dense surface records of Paleo-Indian archaeology in Oregon, if not much of the Great Basin. We found one fluted point, we found some crescents, and they seem to cluster in 8 or 10 discrete locations. We don't think that these are areas where artifacts have been redeposited. The channel system seems to be fairly stable. We don't think we've seen a lot of erosion, which would produce downwind dunes in this area. And so we think what we're dealing with is a more or less intact record in terms of the relationship between artifacts. If you look at the obsidians that are being used here, I'd like to point a couple things out. We're talking about the red arrows down here. This is the Catnip Creek Delta. This is the North Warner Valley. There are a couple of sources of obsidian in the delta where there are cobbles eroding out of the stream banks. And so we have a really high proportion of Badger Creek, Beatty's Butte, and Massacre Lake obsidian. That's because you can pick up cobbles of that and make tools right at that location. So I wouldn't read too much into that pattern. What we also see, though, is a high proportion of obsidians coming from around Alturas, California, Northwest Nevada, the Warner Mountains in that area, and that can't be explained by proximity to the site alone. And so what we think is going on here is that groups are coming from far northeastern California or northwestern Nevada in what's been called the high rock country. This is often basaltic plateaus rather than basins like Guano Valley. And they're probably coming out of the high rock country down into the canyons and out into Guano Valley as part of a seasonal or an annual amount. And so the proportions of those obsidian, the fact that they're well represented, suggests to us that that's where people are coming from, or conversely, where people in Guano Valley are going to and then coming back. If you look at that pattern relative to the sources of obsidian represented in Warner Valley, it's quite different. Whereas the Guano Valley record is strongly pointed towards Nevada, the Warner Valley record is more consistent with places like the Dietz site and the Alkali Basin and some of the other western stem assemblages found there, where you see sources from the Fort Rock Basin and the Alkali Basin represented in greater numbers. A few years ago, Ariane Pinson wrote a paper that argued that people were moving through these northern Great Basin records using obsidian as one of the lines of her evidence. And I think that the Warner Valley record kind of fits into that pattern, whereas the Guana Valley record definitely does not. So Derek is, he's just handed in his prospectus. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I have a general sense of what he's trying to do because I'm his advisor. He's trying to figure out what these clusters represent. Number one, do they differ from one another? Number two, do these represent short-term campsites or potentially places where groups spent longer-term occupations in the valley as a whole, but maybe moved camps periodically as firewood or insects became a problem. Regardless of how groups were using the area, it's really an amazing place. You have water in the delta, which would have offered an attraction for large and small game. Waterfowl would have provided plants. You had obsidian at that location, and you have these corridors going into the higher elevations. When we were there, we saw bighorn sheep grazing on the meadow around the delta. Antelope are abundant, and so today it's still an amazing place, and 10,000 or 9,000 or 12,000 years ago it would have been also a pretty amazing place. So stay tuned for what Derek's going to do. I think there's a really interesting story to be told here. The last place I want to talk about is Foxy-Woxy Valley, which is even farther out into the Oregon Outback, and this is a project that we did in conjunction with the museum staff here. So Foxy-Woxy is similar in size to Guana Valley. It measures a little more than 5 kilometers across. And I want to draw your attention to this particular spit that comes out into the plant floor. In 1996 and 1997, the University of Nevada sent a crew out here and recorded a pretty rich record of Western stemmed archaeological resources. They recorded roughly 200 Western stem points at a couple of dozen sites. The site boundaries are shown here in red. 2 track roads are shown here in green. These purple dots represent the locations of Western stem points that were recorded about 20 years ago. At this particular site here, 35HA840, also known as the Cal Schmidt site, 67 or so Western stem points and a fluted point and a few other artifacts were found as well. As part of our efforts, we wanted to put in a series of backflow trenches because the chronology of this lake is completely unknown. We don't know when it peaked, we don't know when it emptied, or anything like that. And so Teresa was out there putting in a series of backflow trenches, which provided us a sense of how conditions changed over time, although this is something we're still just starting to work out. So you probably recognize those people. We mostly just sat in the shade of the trailer all day while the students walked back and forth. I brought my niece out, she's 15, so I didn't have to pay her very much either. And these projects don't come along very often where you get to work with people that you're just so excited to be with, and it was a really amazing time. So we spent most of our efforts at this site, the Cal Schmidt site, 35HA840. This is a map from 1994 showing that most of the projectile points are scattered around the base of this large hill. And you know, before we got out there, we really had no sense of the scale of this landform. It's roughly 3 kilometers long, and we spent all summer walking back and forth over it, and we still haven't finished recording it. So keep that in mind with what I'm about to show you. So this is 1994. This is 2018. So to date, we've recorded about 2,500 stone tools. They're not all Western stem points. There was one day where we recorded just nothing but scrapers. So that's going to be an interesting story to tell in and of its own. But the volume of material out here is really remarkable, and it's important because although it does seem at this point to be primarily restricted to a surface context, you've got all stages of production of these Western stemmed projectile points, and this is still a question that we need to understand is how are these points made, and what can that tell us about changes in technology over time. And so this is one of the big opportunities we have with the Foxy-Woxy record is we have almost nothing but these Western stem points, and a couple of fluted points and a number of crescents and stuff like that, but we don't have that heavy later footprint like you do in most parts of the Northern Great Basin, where you've got the middle and late Holocene as well. Whatever and whenever it was occurring at Foxy-Woxy Valley, life seemed to have been very, very good early on, and then people stopped going here, and that's, at least from my perspective as a Paleo Indian specialist, that's exactly what I want to find. When the lake is high and when it's low is something we're still trying to figure out. We put in some test pits at the site, but we're still trying to figure out if there's a buried component. This is an example of some of the artifacts we found. And so moving forward, these are the efforts that we'll be focusing on: lake history reconstruction, site recording, site testing. So what have we learned so far? I was trying to debate whether or not I wanted to say that there were more people in southeastern Oregon before 9,400 years ago than there are today. I feel pretty confident having said that now out loud. You know, all signs were that life was good early on, and folks were more adept at making a living than we are today out there. We find these sites along marshes, in Guana Valley along a creek, and in other upland locations marked by that rock art style that I haven't talked about tonight. The big trick is knowing when these sites were occupied. So Paisley, Connolly, we've got a beautiful sequence of radiocarbon dates thanks to Dennis and other colleagues, and they're providing very, very high resolution pictures of life at that place at that time. We need that at these open air sites, and that remains a struggle. One of the things we can do is look at nearby caves and rock shelters like LSP1 or Last Upper Cave, and like some of the other sites I showed you earlier, 9,500 years ago or so seems to be a time when things really get going. Or we can rely on less secure associations with dated landforms. There was a diverse diet, and groups seem to have operated in pretty discrete territories early on. So I've taken enough of your time tonight. I want to thank you very much. I want to in particular thank the staff and John for inviting me and for collaborating over the years. It's been really a highlight of my career to get to work with such wonderful people on such wonderful projects. And I want to thank the land managers and Joe and Ruth Kramer, as I mentioned earlier, and the University of Nevada. So thank you very much. I'd be happy to answer any questions if anyone has any. Yeah.
I wonder, is there a lot known about the technological changes in the tools and the fauna and how they, whether there's a relationship there, what's known about that?
That's a great question. So the question is, what is the relationship that we know between the stone tools, these Western stem points or other types of projectile technology, and the associated food remains? In some sites, like Connolly Caves, you've got really large, well-made spear points, and you have some evidence of larger animals like elk and potentially smaller artiodactyls. And so those two things, at least in my mind, go together: big projectile, big target. At sites like LSP1, we've got big projectiles and tiny rabbits that were probably collected using rabbit drives and nets on the valley floor. And so there have been some studies that have shown that these Western stem projectile points, although they're large, robust implements, they actually also probably served as knives. And so at face value, I think there is this dichotomy between early food remains and early technology at many sites, but I think that at least in some cases the projectiles are being used as knives.
How about the crescents?
If you can figure out what crescents are used for, that will get you the job at the University of Oregon Museum. That's a good one. You've done more than anybody else. They were probably used to hunt and harvest waterfowl.
Good answer.
Yeah, and that.
Yeah, recently they found some points in Texas, about 15,500 years old, that are non-Clovis.
Right.
How do you fit that in with what you're finding in Oregon? Because they don't seem to be the same peoples.
Could you say that last part again?
I was going to say, it doesn't seem like they may be the same peoples.
Well, that's an excellent question. And you know, John sent me that article, and he said, you should read this. And I said, I'll get to it today, and I didn't read it. But I'm roughly familiar with the discovery. The importance of that find, in my mind, is that it's another dot on the map that's older than Clovis, and a type of technology that couldn't be less related to Clovis. And so the fact that it's in Texas, and even farther removed from the Pacific coast, is initially a little bit puzzling. But if you consider the possibility that groups move down the Pacific coast relatively quickly and then moved inland at different places, including perhaps the Columbia River here in the Pacific Northwest. By the time they reached Southern California and down into Mexico, that trip across Southern North America wouldn't have been as daunting as maybe it, as you think. So I don't know ethnically or even technologically in any great detail how the Texas find relates to the early stuff we've been talking about tonight. But I think at a broader level, it's another point where you can say, this does not match the Clovis first paradigm, and it adds additional questions to new models that are being developed. I hope that helps. Yeah.
Could you briefly describe what is this alternative paradigm that's not the land grid in just a few short?
Sure. So both involve traveling from Siberia to the New World across Beringia. But it all has to do with the timing of the glaciers that covered much of Canada. And so there's a time period before maybe 13,500 years ago where that ice-free corridor is still closed. So people were in Alaska before 13,500 years ago. We know that for certain. But the question is, if they're at Paisley Caves or Rimrock Draw or Texas, before that ice-free corridor opens throughout Alaska and northern Canada, how did they get south of that impenetrable ice barrier? And so increasingly, people like Dr. Rillinson and a number of us are thinking the coast of British Columbia may have been less glaciated than originally thought and more viable as a route south of the ice sheets. And so, back to the Texas find for a second, it's seemingly unrelated until you start asking bigger questions like, how did anybody get anywhere south of the ice sheets? And so that's the paradigm. Both involve an origin in northeastern Asia, both involve traversing the Bering Land Bridge, but it's once they got to Alaska, how do you bypass that big block of ice that still periodically covers Canada and the ocean? Yeah, I'm sorry.
I am fortunate enough that my grandfather homesteaded Guam Valley. And for probably 17 years, from the early 60s to early 70s, I was on a horse behind several hundred head of cattle, going back and forth exactly where you were.
Really?
Through Guam Valley, and we would either head up once every other year. We'd go up through Jack Lakes, Guam Valley, to Heart Mountain, and that's where the summer range was. Or we would go up through the Shirk Ranch and up Desert Lake, Spanish Lake, and up that area. But yeah, when you start talking about Guam Valley not having much of it, I don't think we took that many of it. It was pretty shocking. I wish that my father had saved more things.
Sure.
You'd just be walking behind or riding behind, like I said, several hundred head of cattle. And as they're walking through the sagebrush and stuff, they're moving dirt. And I can remember seeing spear heads like this that he had, and just a phenomenal amount of arrowheads.
Yeah.
And you probably know the guy that works for the BLM. His first name is Bill.
Bill Cannon.
What's his name?
Bill Cannon?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's just for anyone that hasn't been to Heart Mountain, you need to go up and drive up. And as you're coming down or going up, there's a section there that shows you. It's called a bathtub ring, and it shows you exactly the high water mark, maybe, of Warner Lake, which went clear down into Nevada. But it's pretty shocking to be up on this rim, 1,000 feet, and you look down and you can see where the water was a couple hundred feet deep, just covered the entire valley.
It sure is.
It's Guam Valley is a great place, and I get a kick out of it when people ask me where you're from. I go, well, I'm from Lakeview, but I really am from Guam Valley.
It's amazing. It's a beautiful location. Yeah.
So in examining the frequency of artifact finds, did you control for the beer incentive?
The beer incentive?
Well, if you're comparing two areas, in one area we got beer, and one area.
You know, I've had the fortune where there's always beer where we go to work, and I don't know why that is. It just always seems to be beer. Yeah.
Last one?
All the, stone artifacts you found from this period, they're all related to food production apparently, and none of them are conflict related. Is that true?
Well, that's tough to know. There was a stone projectile point stuck in the hip of Kennewick Man from the Columbia River, who dates to around the same time period. So, conflict resolution has always been something that's happened. And yeah, I would like to think that there were more resources and less reason for conflict, but at the end of the day, there's always going to be a few people who don't get along. That's a great question. It's something that's really hard to know the answer to.
All right.
Well, thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. And next week, same time, same place, Dr. Todd Brady is going to talk about 130,000 years of human occupation in California? Question mark? I think you'll say no. What we know and don't know about the people in the Americas. I hope you can join us. Thank you so much.